Morning. It is a bit rainy and overcast, so the lighting might be a little bit dark. Oh. I was just sitting down to read the record, and I wasn't actually intending to record. However, I saw this opinion article come up with the title that just struck me, and I was like, oh, I have to record this. It's so. If it wasn't the last video, I don't believe it was the most recent video that I posted, but the one before that, what this ties back to, it's just hilarious. Hilarious. How air conditioning changed politics and the world. That's hilarious because in the video that I just referenced, there was a whole rabbit hole I went down, not only in that video about air conditioning, but when I was referring to it in that video, I was referencing a prior rabbit hole that I had gone down about air conditioning several days before that. And so it's just this tide of air conditioning. I saw this title, it blew me away. It's too, coincidental is not the word, synchronistic. Most neighborhoods are sealed shut now. Rather than the voices of children playing, all you hear is the hum of air conditioning motors. Wow. The cost of maintaining running at full blast. Amazing. Just amazing. So I have been extremely excited to read the Supreme Court cases that just came down, one about Chevron deference and the other one about homelessness. I watched the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court for both of these cases. And up until this point, I have intentionally stayed away from reading any news, opinion coverage of either of these cases because I don't. The intention is to go into this with as much purity, if I may use that term, as possible in regard to the perception that I have. Not going into it with any sort of assessment in my mind, this predetermined assessment as to whether anything that is expressed in these opinions are right or wrong. The intention really is to ground in a sense of openness, to allow a flow of expression that is contemplative and reflective, self-reflective, and perhaps constructive, with foundations in a sort of spiritual, just with a sort of integrated picture from really any perspective. So I suppose in regard to what I was just saying, it's not necessarily about rejecting other, like the intention in not viewing news and opinions is not about rejecting whatever those opinions and the perspectives shared are. It's not about rejecting, it's more about not attaching, sort of not psychologically attaching to any one particular perspective more than another. I suppose going into this, going into reading these cases, the intention has largely been to go in with as much of a clean slate as I can possibly um, ground in. A sense of openness, a sense of trust in and surrender to whatever expression comes through in reading these opinions. And it's not reading it with the intention of projecting a label onto the sort of totality of the case decision or any parts of it to say this is right and this is wrong. It's more just a curiosity to see the structures built within this system, how they express currently, and how they are being utilized as construction materials to continue propagating and supporting a certain narrative, being curious about what that narrative might be, inquiring into narratives that may not be verbally expressed but are also speaking very loudly, and really reflecting, using this structure to really, or the structures that are expressed within the opinions, the sort of infrastructure, the energetic infrastructure to self-reflect, to say, how is this infrastructure alive within me? And does that infrastructure still feel like it is in support of that which I am being pulled toward, that which I feel like I am sort of centered and aligned within in a grounded sense of integrity? And where it isn't, where there isn't that alignment, perhaps there is an invitation there for the birthing, if you will, of a sort of new structure, a new infrastructure, new engineering, new building, new constructing. Yes, perhaps of a different narrative, and perhaps just a different way of perceiving reality, perceiving ourselves, perceiving our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with each other, our relationships with reality and the sort of institutions, leadership, authority, decision making. So that sort of speaks a little bit toward the intentionality that I'm going into this with. That's not to say that the egoic sense of self, who I love very dearly, will make itself known, will express, will speak, and there will be potential emotionality that also surfaces and arises. And so that'll be interesting. I kind of just felt like a little bit of a nervousness in that. So yeah, I'm gonna read the Chevron deference case first. Interestingly, when I was Googling these cases to find the PDF versions of the decisions, finding the PDF of this Chevron deference case was very straightforward and rather easy. Finding the case for the homelessness case, that actually took some digging. That took some digging to find that case. I actually for a hot minute thought maybe this hasn't been posted yet. But eventually I did find it and thought that was quite interesting, how it felt sort of buried in the mire of like opinions and news and tweets. And now I'm probably going to be staying on this for quite some time. This is 114 pages. Now I don't know if I'm going to read the entire thing. Okay. Definitely not unanimous. It's okay. So do that. I don't need all this. Well, see, I wanted that though. Yeah, see, there's just like a little bit. Well, whatever. I guess if I record this whole thing again, I just want to make sure that I can have myself in here. I think that's fine. But if I want that to be full screen, then I have to record a little bit more than that. All right. So here we go with this is the chevron deference case. We've got an audience. Okie dokie, smoke. Here we go. Okay, so seemingly so far they've pivoted away from the sometimes requirement to defer. What's kind of interesting about this particular quote, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. If I remember correctly, the law at that time was largely common law. And common law sort of develops through human experience. What I mean by that is just human relationships as they are experienced in real time, in real life, are what generate perception of order. It's like it's through experience that there is reflection on what would reasonably create order. Order in disputes, order in social relationships, order in a sense of what can we expect from these relationships, within these relationships. And those expectations are in a way what the common law was. Law in a sense of what a perception of order would, like how a sense of order was derived from these real life experiences that appear chaotic, that appear to not be in order. There's something about these relationships, there's something about how they were experienced that feels chaotic, that feels sort of unresolved, that feels open-ended, that feels perhaps unfair, imbalanced. And so the common law was sort of a development through those experiences of, okay, what do we perceive as a resolution of order, of fairness, of justice, of balance for these experiences. And then law also was sort of modeled, not 100% modeled, but a perceptual, a psychological model at the time was through enforcement by the crown, through enforcement, through regulations. I don't know if they were specifically called regulations and statutes at that time. Mandates, perhaps, orders of the crown, whatever they were called, they were I suppose that perhaps they came more from Parliament. I guess I'm not 100% sure. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just put that aside for a moment and just leave a caveat for that. But that kind of also invites this questioning around, what do we mean by law? And these questions aren't new. There are laws passed in Congress, which we sort of know as regulation and statutory law, and then there is the sort of judicial law, these perceptual frameworks that are sort of projected in a generalized sense onto human experience, with the understanding that they are grounded in some sense of order, that they are propagate or they perpetuate some sense of order. So it's interesting how it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is, how to creating infrastructurally a society that is ordered. And just because something may be perceived as ordered, which is another question, is it? But if we just say, well, okay, there is this perception of order here, there is an experience of order, what does that even mean? But there is a perception of order in this. How does this want to express? I guess this question around, is order and the perception of order all that matters? What if that order feels as though it actually isn't useful, isn't productive of that which it is intending to? Is order all that matters? And I suppose at what is the quality of order that this is producing? Order feels like, so often in perceiving reality, there appears to be so much chaos. And yet, there is this order, there is this sort of perfection in life, if I can use that term, in the universe, galactic structures. I've heard so often, I don't remember exactly the terminology used, but something along the lines of the perfection, the exactitude at which the planets orbit the sun, and it's almost as though like the mathematics of how we are in space and time, and how life was able to evolve, if timing had been off by even a split second, the development of life would have been nearly, if not impossible. And so there is this, I think it may be referred to as a Goldilocks. There is this Goldilocks position in space and time that has sort of been the grounds for everything that we experience. Well, maybe not everything, but it's been the grounds for the material existence that is within reality. And so I just kind of wonder why, we have to be so reasonable. Is reason so, is order dependent on reason? I suppose is a question. Is order dependent on reason? Is order dependent on logic? Is order dependent on the human perception of right and wrong? Is there something and is there something bigger that is unfolding in a more organic sense of order, that perhaps too much dependence on reason and logic and practicality blinds us to? Like, to say that too much, it's a toxic codependency on reason, on logic, on practicality. And that's not to say that logic and reason and practicality are wrong, are bad, are anything other than tools to be integrated within the wholeness of being, to have a codependent relationship with logic and reason in a way that everything hinges on, it in an absolute dependence for logic and reason to perceive order, to create order, to determine order, to define order, is perhaps blinding the vision of a greater embodied sense of order that already exists, that is already continuing to unfold, and that doesn't need to be efforted so much. In the decades following Marbury, when the meaning of a statute was at issue, the judicial role was to interpret the act of Congress in order to ascertain the rights of the parties. So there's this creation of structure, the act being structure to relationships. So there's this structure to relationships in order to ascertain the rights of the parties. So looking through the lens of that structure as though it is sort of innocent until proven guilty, it is provided, if you will, deference. Perhaps I'm reading into this. However, that structure is used to ascertain the rights of the parties as though the rights of the parties depends on how a polarized system defines the structures of relationships. When rights of the parties what I'm referring to at the moment with rights are those which are inalienable. Earmarking that, dog-earing that, putting a pin in that, a bookmark, I just find that so inverted. I feel like I'm like 30 minutes in. I don't know how long I've been recording, but I feel like I'm 20 to 30 minutes into this and I'm only on the second page. Cannot rush source. Well, I don't want to say cannot. I do not intend to rush the flow that comes through. Masters of the subject. Questionable. It's interesting here. Undoubtedly, questions of statutory interpretation are for the courts to resolve, giving appropriate weight to the judgment of those whose special duty is to administer the question's statute. So there's sort of this perception, and there's law, and then there's interpretation of law, interpretation of how that law applies, of what that law means. So there's sort of the creation of the bones of the structure, and then there is a final definition of what those bones do, how those bones relate to experiences within the body. But in a final, in a hierarchical, this is how it is way. Until something else comes before us that we can then reassess. But until then, this is how it is, and that's all there is to it. When it's looked at as more of a whole system, an interconnected system, like the body. I was listening to someone yesterday, I think it was yesterday, talk about how so much of the medical field in the modern sort of United States, at least, culture is based on these individualized specialties. And within the individualized specialties of the body, there tends to be an unsatisfying, quote unquote, sort of level of communication between them. And where there is attention focused on a specialty, on a particular aspect, if you will, of the body, that focus and attention may show outcrops, if you will, in other areas of the body. And so there is this sort of lack, if you will, of communication and perception of the body as a whole system. And just inquiring and exploring how relating to the body and aspects of the body as independent, sort of specialized units alone, how that feels relatively inadequate. And to say that, well, there is an authority on the bones and there is an authority on the muscle, there's an authority on the heart, there is an authority on the eyes, there is an authority on the nose and throat, there is an authority on the liver, and they're masters. And yet there is so much contention and apparent conflict around the health and wellness of the body in the culture, the body within the culture, and there is this perceived dissatisfaction with the medical system and how it relates to the body, how it communicates about the body, how it attends to the body. Yeah, so it's basically saying it seems to be saying that the Supreme Court is not mandated to defer to agency interpretations, although agency fact-finding and policy making is sort of entitled, if you will, to deference. It's the agency interpretations of policy and fact-finding that the court is not required to give deference to. Interesting use of language. Chevron insists on more than the quote respect historically given to executive branch. It demands that courts mechanically afford binding deference to agency interpretations. Interesting reference to the mechanics, or it's an interesting analogy using mechanical language. In a way, it's sort of illuminating, exposing, perhaps even to a degree rejecting the mechanistic process within this context. More interesting language. Chevron cannot be reconciled with the APA by presuming that statutory ambiguities are implicit delegations to agencies. That presumption does not approximate reality. A statutory ambiguity does not necessarily reflect a congressional intent that an agency, as opposed to a court, resolve the resulting interpretive question. Well, that is sort of a question. If Congress is aware that through court precedent, ambiguities in agency statutes are sort of left to the agency to decide, that is given deference, then I can totally see how Congress would say, okay, well, then we're just gonna, that there would be intentionality in leaving some statutes ambiguous. So to a degree, that presumption perhaps does approximate a certain aspect of reality. But in an agency case, as in any other, there is a best reading all the same. The reading the court would have reached if no agency were involved. Just because the Supreme Court is interpreting, the Supreme Court's interpretation is not necessarily synonymous with a best reading. The best, if you will, feels very relative. Yeah, this is kind of crazy. It therefore makes no sense to speak of a, quote, permissible interpretation that is not the one the court, after applying all relevant interpretive tools, concludes is best. Yeah, see, this is so interesting too, because this reminds me of the essay I referred to in the last video about ChatGPT, and how, I suppose in using similar language here of ambiguities, there, I could say similarly the phrase unknowing. There is an aspect of confusion, there is an aspect of non-clarity, if you will. There is this question mark where it's not directly straightforward what feels quote unquote best. And it's through mechanisms of precedent and that which has already sort of been measured and inculcated, if you will, into the psychological structures of how we relate to one another and how we engage in social relationships, that continuously narrows and narrows and narrows the toolbox through which we interpret, through which we address and confront question marks, to the point where in her essay she emphasized how when students were asked a particular question to resolve, if you will, or given a problem to resolve, that their answer was very, very similar to the answer generated by the ChatGPT. Her essay went on to explore the dimensionality of unknowing and how ChatGPT and the reflection that one's answer, or the ChatGPT, how that reflects on how one relates to the world and interprets the world, how that reflection can open the doorways to creative thought. And so courts, who depend on precedent for this perception of order, that order that's being created, that perception of order is narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing to a point where I don't even know that I would say it's necessarily a competence as much as it's an automatic, mechanical, if you will, constrained, almost recycling of the same material. In a way, it's kind of, it's reminding me of the definition of insanity, where you something like you do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. It sounds to me like the reach of statutes, the reach of those structures. I mean, perhaps ambiguities are delegations in the sense of where there is ambiguity, where there is sort of non-clarity, where there is confusion, if you will, to the reasoned mental body, there is necessarily delegation to extrasensory aspects of being. Not necessarily to judge per se, but to listen. Okay, we're back after a short pause. Cognizant of the limits of human language and foresight, the framers anticipated that all new laws, though penned with the greatest technical skill and passed on the fullest and most mature deliberation, would be more or less obscure and equivocal until their meaning was settled by a series of particular discussions and adjudications. It's interesting because the image that's coming to me in regard to settled is dust, but soil, the soil that settles, and eventually that settled material gets buried and buried and buried and buried until, I suppose, it's either dug up and, if you will, I don't know if I'd say repurposed, but for repurposing, if you will, and or it gets so deeply buried it potentially transforms in materiality, in its chemistry. I suppose you could say becoming foundational. It's interesting though, because even foundations can move and shake and break. Yeah, I mean, what's also interesting about giving respect predominantly to draftsmen of the laws who were afterwards called upon to interpret those laws. You know, bias comes through. It's more though in a way that's, it's a tendency. There's a tendency to more quickly reflect on another's behavior, another's actions with judgment than there is to reflect on and judge, if you will, the behaviors and actions of oneself. So for the draftsman of these actions, if you will, the draftsman of these structures of relationship, for them to reflect on that which they created, what comes through is that there is more of a tendency to judge quicker, to more quickly judge how others' behaviors and actions are not in accordance with the laws, if you will, than it is for there to be a tendency for those draftsmen to reflect on themselves and to reflect on the law, if you will, that perhaps there is room for improvement, if I can use that phraseology, that there can be malleability, that there can be adaptability, that not that the laws are per se wrong, more that the laws are ambiguous. And what's wrong with being ambiguous? What if you just acknowledge that there is ambiguity and that that's okay? It's okay that there is ambiguity. It's okay that it's not clear, and with gratitude, thank you. Thank you for bringing this ambiguity to our attention. This actually informs us as to how to more effectively, if you will, tailor these statutes, or maybe not tailor these statutes, but perhaps even just reflect on how the act can be of service to both a sense of a order, a sense of fairness, a sense of correctness, if you will, for both parties, both the Congress, the federal agency, and what their intentionality is under this statute, and the intentionality of the fishermen in fishing. So that it's sort of more of a quote-unquote win-win, that it is supportive of both parties' intentions and desires in a way that there is deep listening on both sides. Not where there's this, you're right and I'm wrong, you win and I lose. More of a partnership, more of that collaborative energy, more of that collaborative relationship. It's kind of interesting to think about defining the character of something as part of its creation, like you would in a fictional novel, in juxtaposition with sort of reading, I don't know if I'd say necessarily in contrast to, and in juxtaposition, as though they're mutually exclusive. There definitely appears to be some overlap, but for lack of a better phrase, in juxtaposition with reading the landscape of the administrative state, even where it's not necessarily defined and named as such. What does the landscape look like prior to codification of it? What does it look like? And I'm not even talking about prior to in United States history. I'm just, in a sort of broader sense, what is the administrative body, what character speaks through it, what character speaks of its own accord? Well, I suppose the APA was created to address the proliferation of federal agencies. So in a landscape even prior to that proliferation, what would the character have been of administration? What was the life of administration? What did that look like? What did that feel like? What did that say? The question in Chevron was whether an EPA regulation allowing states to treat all of the pollution-emitting devices within the same industrial grouping as though they were encased within a single bubble was consistent with the term stationary source as used in the Clean Air Act. That's really interesting. This is reminding me of the commentary I watched weeks ago I don't recall which video this is in offhand, but it had to do with biblical interpretation. And there was commentary about how I suppose the biblical story of I think it was the apocalypse that he was referring to, but it has a different name that I'm forgetting at the moment. Um, but that story was constructed sort of, I guess you could say inferred, not even inferred per se, but added in a way to the biblical narrative and how it was largely quote unquote invented. And this is kind of reminding me of that invention. Is there a fine line? Is it synonymous to say emergence and invention? Hmm. You know, this is also kind of interesting because what's coming through is that it's in a way analogous to, I mean, how they're describing this. A court instead, in the, okay, so in the absence, or excuse me, where a statute is silent or ambiguous, where there is not clarity, a court instead had to set aside, this is under Chevron, the Chevron decision. A court instead had to set aside the traditional interpretive tools, which I'm sort of what's coming through is an analogy to mental reason. Sort of traditional interpretive tools being reason and logic and mental pragmatism, mental deduction, mechanistic deduction, and deferring to the agency if it had offered a permissible construction of the statute. The agency, in a way, a little bit of a stretch, but in a way almost coming through as agency within oneself, agency being that source beyond the egoic sense of self, that the bigger than self sort of perception, awareness, sensitivity, if you will. Excuse me, the agency being the will within oneself that feels divinely guided, that feels deeply meaningful, and to a degree at times can feel deeply impersonal, which is sort of, I don't know if it's ironic or paradoxical to have deep meaning simultaneously with deep impersonal experience of that meaning. But that's what's coming through in terms of agency and deferring to that sense of agency. So in a way, it's setting aside the traditional sort of mental mechanistic pragmatism for the inner sense of agency that is so deeply imbued and embedded and innate within the sense of experience within oneself that is bigger than oneself. So it's interesting how that interpretation, that invention, that additive to that just additive, that invention now sort of being reined back in, reining it back in, reining it back to the traditional. Now, that's not to say anything about this additive invention, if you will, being right or wrong, good or bad. It's just interesting to reframe it a bit differently. But in saying all this, there is also recognition and acknowledgement that the agency as referenced here is largely tends to act also from, at least in the from observation here, there has been a large tendency to act from interpretations with perhaps a particular agenda in mind, in the mental body, which also sort of brings into question agency from a higher perspective, and whether that too has some quote unquote agenda in terms of destiny, destined experience. I didn't even read that. That's hilarious. Yeah, see, this is often the perception, is that where there isn't clarity in an absolute sense, where there is ambiguity, where there is chaos, there also seems to simultaneously be this fear of disorder, and this fear that order will not emerge from within this chaos, this perception of chaos. So there is this belief, this really strongly held belief, that there is this unbreakable, it's like this unbreakable distrust, or just this deep distrust in what appears ambiguous, and that it will always remain perceived and experienced as ambiguous, and therefore disordered. In the business of statutory interpretation, if it is not the best, it is not permissible. Wow. I mean, that's a big statement. That's a really big statement. It therefore makes no sense to speak of a permissible interpretation that is not the one the court, after applying all relevant interpretive tools, concludes is best. In the business of statutory interpretation, if it is not the best, it is not permissible. That is a huge statement. I can't even. Wow. Just putting that on take out the statutory and just make it interpretation. In the business of interpretation, if it is not the best, it is not permissible. Wow. What is the difference between technical statutory questions and sort of statutory factual questions. Correct, best, who's to say? The court? Nine people? What just came through is, but resolution of statutory ambiguities involves legal interpretation. Philosophical, perhaps, interpretation? Dare I say spiritual interpretation? What is that? Anagogical interpretation? Why is it just legal? In truth, Chevron's justifying presumption of fiction. There's that quote-unquote invention. The other thing about this quote and saying it's fiction, in a way it's kind of, to me, a little bit also saying, well, that means that the best interpretation being non-fictional, being real, being approximate to reality. But is the Supreme Court the ultimate authority on what approximates reality? So the sort of fictional invention, if you will, being untethered. Being untethered from real law, real structural integrity. Being untethered from that which is perceived as having real integrity. I think I'm going to take a break at the moment. Okay. So what I'm feeling at the moment is finishing reading up the opinion of the court in this Chevron case, reading Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, and then reading Justice Kagan's dissent. Now that isn't all inclusive of all the justices' opinions as presented in this case. That not reading those other cases or those other opinions does not necessarily mean to me that, or not feeling called to read the opinions of all the justices doesn't necessarily mean to me that those opinions that I am not reading in this moment are less valuable, less important, less significant, less meaningful, and less valuable. Okay, here we go. The Chevron Project. A decaying husk. Interesting to reference judicial humility in the same opinion as saying basically that the court knows best and anything otherwise is not permissible. Just because something has emphatically been the province and duty of a department for over 220 years certainly does not equate to being experts. What does it mean to be an expert? Is it just dependent on time elapsing? It is said that to be a master, you have to, 10,000 hours of dedicated focus and attention toward some particular context. But does that mean that everyone who does so is a master? Is there really a definition of expert? Or is that ambiguous too? It's interesting too because which requires judges to decide all relevant questions of law. Is what is the best interpretation a question of law? What's coming through on this is that in our lives are not quote unquote complete of a bigger picture, if you will. They are not in a certain dimensional aspect. They are not presenting the complete unfoldment. In another dimensionality, they are. That fuller, perfect, complete picture is within the being, the existence of every individual in a fractal, what's the word? Holographic. In a fractal, holographic sense, that complete perfect story, that complete perfect experience, picture, what have you, is unfolding, is emerging, is presenting within everyone. In saying that, there is also a dimensionality of the perfect, complete picture that in a dualistic sort of experience is less, if you will, consciously perceived as such. And so in that sort of more contracted perception, the way that life tends to be perceived through that lens is as imperfect, is as incomplete. And so in that imperfection and incompleteness, or just in that perception of incompleteness and imperfection, there is this experience, there is this room, there is this simultaneity of ambiguity that leaves room, if you will, for another to quote unquote fill that gap. So that is to say, upon my transition from this lifetime, or it's to say that work, if you will, the life of someone's life's work, that is taken up by someone else and referenced reference material, derivative material, and on and on and on. So everyone sort of fills gaps that are left by preceding generations of individuals, if you will. And so it's interesting to perceive it in that way, and then and it would usually prefer Congress, and Congress would usually prefer that actor. Okay, so Congress knows that it does not, in fact, cannot write perfect, complete regulatory statutes, in the same sense that the human individual, if you will, the life of human being, that perception of itself from a more contracted sense, from an individualized, egoic, perhaps, sense of self, it feels, it perceives that it cannot write perfect, complete regulatory statutes, although there perhaps simultaneously exists an alternative dimensional reality in which that already exists and is inalienable. Setting that aside for just a moment, so it goes on, Congress knows that those statutes will inevitably contain ambiguities that some other actor will have to resolve, and gaps that some other actor will have to fill. And it would usually prefer that actor to be the responsible agency, not a court. So it's also interesting to perceive when there is a quote-unquote passing on of one's legacy, one could say, to, just for example, another person. The question being, well, is it a responsible agency or a court? So this very binary, polarized question, or that a question that sort of assumes a binary framework. And in asking this question more from a place of one's self-experience, the experience of one's agency, the experience of, rather than saying court, the experience of one's judgment, discernment, it would usually prefer that actor to be the responsible agency, the will, the inner guidance, if you will, and the inner discernment. Perhaps they're not mutually exclusive. That together, that sort of merged perceptual awareness of one's experience perhaps doesn't leave ambiguity, as much ambiguity as the logical, reasonable mental body may think it does and perceive it too. Good usage of words. I love this. I believe they meant to say define. That inquiry is rigorous. A court must exhaust all the traditional tools of statutory construction to define statutory meaning. But it said divine. Oh my god, I love that. Yeah, divinate. Must cede the primary interpretive role. That's the issue. Yeah, see, my question, I understand what the dissent is saying in terms of interpreting concepts. I find it also interesting in these examples that are given like this one, Congress directed the Department of the Interior and the Federal Aviation Administration to reduce noise from aircraft flying over Grand Canyon National Park, specifically to, quote, provide for substantial restoration of the natural quiet, end quote. The questions the dissent is asking are the interpretation of how much noise is consistent with, quote, the natural quiet, end quote. But my question is more, why did Congress direct that? What was Congress's purpose in providing for substantial restoration of the natural quiet? Not necessarily, I'm not saying it's not significant to interpret natural quiet, but more so, what prompted Congress to enact structures of social relationship that provide for substantial restoration of the natural quiet? Because what comes through to me, and I'm not saying that this is the only purpose behind this, but one thing that comes through is perhaps because of tourism, that tourism of the Grand Canyon is a lucrative business. In order to ensure that profits continue streaming in through this tourism sector industry, perhaps they have received complaints, if you will, from tourists about the noise of the aircraft. And so Congress is being lobbied, perhaps, by certain interest groups that profit from tourism. And so there is a push for the natural quiet, so it's not even really asking questions that go to the underlying purpose behind providing for substantial restoration, which again is an important interpretive question. However, I don't know that interpreting natural quiet is going to, quote unquote, solve whatever problem is perceived, is experienced. That is, I suppose, a bit more of a policy question than a question of law. Yeah, see, the interesting thing about this too is if there have been complaints about the noise, what are those complaints specifically about? What are they referring to? When are they referring to? How often are the complaints of the same nature? Perhaps that is more of a quote-unquote factual question. But there there's an invitation there for more transparency. Again, divine. Maybe it does mean divine? Interesting. Okay. I feel I've read enough. Good morning. yesterday I was feeling quite tired, uh, and I've been having so many dreams. I'm not even confident in saying that I've had a restful night's sleep. However, I really want to uh, open myself to any expression that wants to come through for this grants pass opinion. So we're going to get into it. Let's try this again. We'll get there. We'll get there. We're already there. We're already there. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Here we are. Again with this word project. The Martin Project. As though it is kind of some like experimental creation that we're gonna like give this a grade. I don't know, in a way that you can kind of just, it feels to me as I'm leaning into this, it just kind of feels like it's that scenario where where there is either a passing or failing grade. It's either you pass or you fail. And there's relatively little regard given to the reality that is lived within either the pass or the fail. I don't know, it just feels very, it feels, I said this in the last case about reining in, and using this terminology of project, that what they are reining in are these projects, gives them a sort of status, as they're referring to status. It almost feels like there's this status of immaturity. It's just, it has that kind of feel of, oh, it's just your project. Like, it's not a big deal. I don't know how to word this. There's a lack of integrity. That there feels like a lack of integrity in using this specific terminology of project. There's a feeling of a lack of reality. Like it doesn't feel like it's wholly inclusive of a reality that is meaningful and purposeful and serious, real to another, through another lens, through another's experience, if you will. And so in that disregarding of the reality of another's experience and the degree of, I'm not really sure the words to put on this, but the feeling around this terminology of project, which was also used in the case, I'm blanking. Oh my gosh, what was the case I just read? Whatever case it was, it used the term project as well, I think more than once. Yeah, thank you. In a way, as though the feeling is that in a way, using this terminology of project feels as though that that project, if you will, doesn't matter. That the success and or failure of that project doesn't really matter. It's just a project. It's just a thing that you've done. It's just a thing that you have created, and now we're moving on. It just has that kind of feeling, and I know that the articulation is a little bit loose, and that's okay, but it just has that feeling of, this was a valiant effort, and we're gonna move on now. It's funny, actually. It's kind of interesting because the way that it's coming through, and the way that I suppose I could express it more easily, if you will, is in a very, I say this very hesitantly, but it's coming through in a rather childlike way, a rather immature, and just what I mean by that is perhaps there's some emotion here, but it's that kind of not really caring what the implications are of what's said, not really even thinking that much about the implications. It's just this very kind of carefree, playfulness. And so that kind of ironically is perhaps on the flip side, the perception of this project, the Martin project, or whatever project was referenced. I think they were actually referring to the Chevron project. So these case law Supreme Court projects that, in perceiving them as sort of this childlike, almost nuisance to what is perceived as like the adult, what is perceived as the true, yeah, it's just like these nuisances that are bothersome. They're like, it's almost like flies. It's almost like, okay, can we just like get rid of these annoyances, these nuisances, these bothersome, I don't even know what word to put on it, and I'm feeling this frustration in like expressing this because it's not really coming through. I feel like I have to like really, but I can feel it, and I can feel in myself that there is something being pointed toward, and like very incrementally these words are coming out, like nuisance. Like when I said nuisance, it was like, yeah, okay, that kind of hit the nail on the head. Where it feels like there is this annoying noise in the air of what is perceived as, yes, foundational, but more than that, like really what matters. That's the perception of this noise, this perception of there being noise, and that noise wanting to be canceled out and rejected because it's taking away the perception, is that that noise is taking away from the really important work that needs to get done, and that there cannot be these distractions. These distractions are looked at as very childish. They're looked at as very not meaningless, but not really having much gravity. Wow. The government began reporting data on homelessness only as recent as 2007? As the number of homeless individuals has grown, the number of homeless encampments across the country has increased as well, in numbers not seen in almost a century. Was that data collected? Who collected that data? Was that states? If the federal government hadn't started collecting data on homeless since as early as 2007? Regardless of why someone might be camping in a public space, it's so about the use of public space. That's it. It's the use of public space. In this particular context of public camping, it applies more often than not to homeless citizens, to those who are perceived as homeless. I don't know what I'm saying here. Anyway, like, okay. I want to say really quickly that I'm finding myself feeling as though I'm reading this at a bit more of a I'm reading this at more of a surface level than I read the last case. And so I want to express that, because I feel like as I'm reading this, I'm reading the surface level of it, and I'm finding it challenging in this moment energetically to dive more deeply into it. I feel like when I'm diving more deeply into it, or opening up to a deeper depth, that it's sort of, that's where there's this blank, like. And so this is kind of an interesting experience because of that, and because I sort of have an understanding that there is so much more depth to it, and being okay with just sort of skimming the surface at the moment and letting it kind of settle and simmer, if you will. Perhaps that's moving forward as you know, there is continued unfoldment and emergence. But yeah, I just feel that in myself. I have felt it since I began reading this morning. Perhaps why there was some struggle, if you will, to articulate what I was talking about, even with the quote unquote project, and how I was feeling with that. It was almost like I almost felt blocked. Not really blocked, but I just kind of, it's almost as though I'm staring into this just like really bright white space. And I can feel a lot in the space, and I can kind of conceptually vision a bit of information coming through, and yet I can't, it's like the information is just kind of like I can't really follow the trail very far. It's like it's very cloudy but really bright white. It's like those really the I guess what's considered the silver lining of clouds where it's so bright but it's clouded, and it's that kind of imagery that I'm sort of getting as I'm contemplating. And what was coming through is that there isn't much ontological contemplation in this moment. At least it doesn't feel like that's a lot of what's happening. It's more of this sort of skimming surface level, and that's okay. I just got the image of those jet skis, like when you're jet skiing on the ocean and you're just kind of like skimming the surface of these of this really, really, really deep um, fluid. Anyway, okay, so let's continue on. The cruel and unusual punishments clause prohibits certain methods of punishment a government may impose after a criminal conviction, but it does not impose any substantive limits on what conduct a state may criminalize. Going further to say, Martin had shackled the hands of public officials trying to redress the serious societal concern of homelessness. Yeah, I mean, it seems like the biggest issue about Martin and why it's a nuisance is because Martin seems to extend the reach of the cruel and unusual punishment clause, to extend it beyond the post criminalization phase. It was aimed at the method and type of punishment. It wasn't aimed at the actual criminalization of whatever it is, whatever the context is. But it's kind of interesting because that sort of interpretation of the cruel and unusual punishment, which quite honestly I don't consciously know. I don't have conscious awareness around the what the cruel and unusual punishment clause was based off of, why the history of that clause's inclusion within the Constitution. I don't know what sort of preceded that in an experiential sort of psychological sense, and why it was included to begin with. They mentioned a little bit in here about what didn't want to what the framers, I suppose, didn't want to tolerate anymore, that perhaps they had experienced. They said something like, let me just go back up to it really quick. The Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishments clause has always been considered, and properly so, to be directed at the method or kind of punishment a government may impose for the violation of criminal statutes. It was adopted to ensure that the new nation would never resort to certain formerly tolerated punishments considered cruel because they were calculated to superadd terror, pain, or disgrace, and considered unusual because by the time of the amendment's adoption they had long fallen out of use. The cruel and unusual punishments clause focuses on the question what method or kind of punishment a government may impose after a criminal conviction, not on the question whether a government may criminalize particular behavior in the first place. it's interesting because this really brings into question what is meant by punishment. What is punishment? What is perceived as a punishment? What is punishment inclusive of? And it can be said that punishment is the criminalization of particular behavior in the first place. That codification, if you will, of criminal behavior, the perception of criminal behavior, the statutory codification of behavior as criminal, that in and of itself could be considered punishment. So perhaps this question, what method or kind of punishment a government may impose, isn't just after a criminal conviction. It is the criminal conviction in and of itself. Why isn't that a punishment, is my question. Why is that not considered a punishment? Why is it that just because something is statutorily regulated as criminal, that doesn't too act, if you will, or be perceived or experienced as a punishment, defined as a punishment, conceptualized as a punishment? It's drawing a line between what is codified as criminal and what is subsequently the government's behavior toward that criminalized behavior, if you will. It's the behavior of the government in response, if you will, to the behavior of a particular individual or class of individuals. So I guess in that way, it does make a little bit of sense, because it's focusing on the government's behavior, but on the other hand, criminalizing certain behavior in a codified fashion is also the government's behavior. Now, perhaps there is some relationship to the citizenry, if you will, where the citizenry has to vote on it. I'm not really sure the process for all of it, for codifying what is criminal and what is not criminal, and whether there is input through the citizenry. But the codification itself is through a governmental authority. And so that is governmental action, that is governmental behavior of criminalization, to criminalize. This isn't about, in this moment as I'm expressing this, it isn't about any particular criminal behavior. It's just about the criminalization process in and of itself, I suppose, and the government's relationship in that, to that. And how this all ties back to what is punishment. I mean, I also kind of feel like it's because homelessness hasn't been codified as criminal behavior, it's easy to say that the actions of the government, the actions of the city, is not directly to criminalize homelessness. It's not criminalizing homelessness. The the behavior of the city is not per se criminalizing homelessness. It's easy to say that. But the implication of the city's actions criminalizes homelessness, what is it, de jure or whatever? Like in action, in practice. It is criminalizing homelessness. What is it to codify criminalism? What is it to, through codification, codify criminal behavior? What is the purpose of that behavior? Putting it in statutory documents. What is that doing? And how is that any different than taking action in an almost identical way on the street, even if it's not codified as that? Anyway, okay. Again, efforts at addressing homelessness. These are all, this continuously is pointing toward these camping regulations, these camping statutes as being used to address homelessness. To just say that these statutes are generally applicable and can apply to anyone, not just homelessness, is kind of silly when all you're doing is talking about how these and similar statutes are being used to address homelessness. That is the statutory intent. That is the legislative intent, is to address homelessness. And it just so happens that it can also apply to other people, to people who are not perceived as quote unquote homeless, but just so happen to be experiencing a circumstance, if you will, that on its face may look not that different. Seems like it's more, but if many other constitutional provisions address what a government may not criminalize, and how it may not go about securing a conviction, the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments focuses on what a government may not focuses on how a government may not punish, must not punish. Yeah, so it's like, but if many other constitutional provisions address what a government must not criminalize and how it must not go about securing a conviction. The Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments focuses on how a government must not punish. This is where I understand, I get why they're thinking of punishment only in the context of after criminal conviction, post-criminal conviction, how that has traditionally perhaps been the perception of punishment, been the where punishment is activated. But going back to interpretation, and perhaps a more anagogical interpretation, the question arises whether there is a multidimensional perception of punishment that is also inclusive of pre-criminalization. The criminalization process in and of itself. And just because tradition has viewed punishment as post-conviction doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be that way forever. That we as a society are forever tethered to that perception alone. Very narrow perception alone. It doesn't have to mean that. And perhaps this is an invitation to really explore what it is to punish, what it is to experience punishment, and that it can and often does experientially go and perceptually go well beyond post-conviction. Punishments like those were cruel because they were calculated to superadd terror, pain, or disgrace. To superadd to what? A conviction? An overall experience? Superadd to what? And they were unusual because by the time of the amendment's adoption, they had long fallen out of use. Use for what? For conviction? For post-conviction measures? Nowhere in this historic interpretation is there anything about the framers adding the cruel and unusual punishment clause to narrowly apply in post-criminal conviction. It's talking about punishment post-conviction, I suppose, post-determination of liability. But where did it come in about that post-liability, applying and specifically tailored within the context of criminality, codified statutory criminality? Yeah, see, it's quoted in a case, but where did this come from? Impose for the violation of criminal statutes. Is that in the phrase of the Constitution? Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed. nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. The Eighth Amendment deals only with criminal punishment and has no application to civil processes. Where did this come from? What? Isn't this what the court is saying it doesn't do? Where did this come from? It's very easy to look. I mean, this is such a narrow, it is such a narrow interpretation of the history of the Eighth Amendment that it's almost meaningless. There is so much more to the Eighth Amendment's prohibition that I feel curious about. Like, how did it evolve to only be applicable to the violation of criminal statutes? Was it really unanimous? Was it unanimous at all that it not only applied to criminal statutes, but that its purpose was to prohibit what was perceived at the time as barbaric? Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it also brings into question what is really intended and meant as crime. And it's kind of, this is saying at common law, complete crime generally required both a will and an act. That has nothing to do with whether it was codified by the governing authority. It was considered a crime nonetheless, or it was perceived as a crime nonetheless, regardless of whether it was codified by the governing body. At least that's the way that I'm currently interpreting this. Yeah, so it's like this perception of crime is what the governing body has taken and extrapolated from to codify as such. So the codification of a crime is based and rooted in the perception of a crime having occurred nonetheless, having occurred first and foremost. And then it just so happens that the governing body has codified it as whatever the intentionality is that specifically may have correlated, if you will, with the action as like a package, as like a full package that is now packaged and codified as this crime that had already been perceived and experienced in society as criminal before it was even codified as such. So this question, this exploration of what it even is to what it even is to criminally behave. Maybe it's this cruel and unusual punishment clause the interpretation relying on the codification of criminal behavior only. So let's keep going. Let's keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. They're using involuntary here, it seems to me, in two different contexts. One is the involuntariness of one's status, if you will, as an alcoholic, as a homeless person, the involuntary nature of that status, or implicit within that status, if you will. And then there's also the involuntariness because of an external inadequacy, if I may put it that way. So one is talking about an involuntariness that's a bit more implied and inherent, and then there's an involuntariness which is more external, in the sense that they've referred to the involuntariness because of a lack of shelter, a lack of accessible shelter. And the involuntariness referred to by the dissent, I haven't read the dissent, but what was just referred to in this opinion was essentially pointing towards the argument there being referred to by the opinion of the dissent, was referring to an involuntariness because of shelter inadequacy, it appeared. Involuntarily. So still, the plaintiffs and the dissent insist laws like these seek to regulate actions that are in some sense involuntary, for some homeless persons cannot help but do what the law forbids. And to my initial understanding of this is that they are referring to they cannot help but do it because of the lack of accessible shelters, not necessarily because of an innate byproduct of one's quote-unquote status. Yeah, see, the challenge here for the plaintiff's argument is that in this case that they're referring to that allowed for a small intrusion, if you will, was because the statute really specifically criminalizes status more than in this case where the perception and the potential effect of the statute criminalizes status it's all in effect. It's not necessarily what is specifically textual in codified. It's not in text applying to status, but in effect it can be. It potentially is, and most often seems to be. The involuntariness in this particular grants pass case is not being is not correlated with someone's quote-unquote status. It's the involuntariness is being correlated with an external availability. Yeah, see, they have the benefit, if you will, of easily referencing laws addressing mere status, because that's not the law in this particular case is not addressing status, mere status per se. But the effect of the law is narrowly curtailed to a class in effect. And there is plenty of case law and history showing how in effect and in application, laws that may not be per se on its face in plain text articulating a particular status to be addressed, or that it applies to a particular class, in application and in effect, that happens. And that is exactly a lot of how our case law has evolved over time to be more protective of those classes. Yeah. I mean, this to me is just the literal text interpretation predominating, dominating really any other interpretive lens, as I suppose what was being considered in the Chevron case as the best interpretation, and therefore anything that otherwise appears permissible is not permissible. I'm not necessarily saying that those with nowhere else to go should or shouldn't be a protected class. Just sort of exploring the possibility that reality exists. And what would that, if anything, shift within this framework, rather than having it more activated as a defense, if you will, having it as an upfront, I don't know if I'd necessarily say barrier, but aspect of the human experience, aspect of the experience of relating to one another that cannot be, that is accorded valid, that is accorded validity, that is accorded deep listening, that is accorded with all the other protections that are available to protected classes. What are the implications of that, potentially? Framed a different way, all this represents only a small sample of what about the legion of liberties our society affords from societal interference. What if the constitutional framework is perceived as an experiment, a project? I think perhaps that's what I was sort of maybe pointing toward earlier when I was like, it's almost as though all these nuisance cases are projects and experiments, but not the constitutional framework. Oh no. That's the real deal. I mean, I think that's a fair question. Especially in the context of what I was saying regarding, this sort of in effect class. But in a way, this is why it's interesting how just because something may be hard to prove, that something may be hard to measure, the laws, this is like almost a perfect example of how laws are, and the framework for how we relate to one another, it's often sort of based on what is easily accessible, what is easily measurable. And I'm using the word easily very loosely here. I recognize that it's, first of all, relative, and it's easier said than done, but it's easy to encounter someone in a park who is in a tent. It's easy to encounter someone in a park who is sleeping on a bench. It's easy to encounter, and by easy I just mean it's easily observable. It's easily articulable. It's easily provable, if you will. And so these more easily provable experiences are often what become the default sort of threshold that one then has to defend themselves against, where it's not really innocent until proven guilty. It's okay, I perceive you as guilty of violating this code around camping. So I'm going to cite you a fine, or I'm going to cite you. And if you have some kind of defense to it, then you have to go and defend yourself. You have to go prove that it was involuntary. You have the burden of proving this really, really hard standard. And there's something about that structure to me that is inherently unfair. It's inherently not the whole picture. And I'm not necessarily saying this in any kind of defense of those who, are acting out of accordance with regulations. However, I find that the process of criminality, the process that defines criminality, the process that measures criminality, the process that observes and applies and mechanizes the experience of criminality there's something inherently unfair. There's a power dynamic here. There's a power dynamic in this infrastructure that prioritizes the enforceability and the authority of those who are quote unquote responsible for articulating what it is for this process to unfold, the unfoldment of this process. And it just feels like a blockade. It feels like, it almost feels like an impossibility for quote unquote fair treatment, for equality, for the respect of individuals because of their intrinsic value, the intrinsic value of their existence in and of itself. Just because they exist, they have value. And I don't mean value that is extracted for profit. I mean value and meaning in the sense of something bigger than the perception of that contracted sense of oneself that goes beyond sort of even the mental comprehension of what it is to be human, if you will. You know, I kind of feel like these cases, they get into the weeds, which I love. I love getting into the weeds of meaning and sort of the infrastructural framework of concepts, including involuntary. And yet sometimes in reading these cases, I feel like they're so heavily reliant on defining the specifics of concepts and the specifics of interpretation in a very widely general, applicable, universal sense, that it loses sight of something else. It loses sight of what it is to be in relationship with one another, what it is to support one another. And I just don't feel as though this particular framework and this particular adjudicative process is really, nor the sort of city administrative process and intentionality. I don't feel as though these architectures are giving that space, are providing that space and openness to really explore the depth of why these relationships are existing the way that they're existing, to get more into the heart, if you will, of where we're at as a society. And I don't know specifically that prioritizing specific definitions and measurements of involuntary so that law enforcement can more accurately determine the behavior of someone in a park, whether that is really the issue that is inviting curiosity. I'm not saying that this particular framework and process of adjudication is wrong and bad. I'm not saying that it doesn't have value. I'm not saying that it's insignificant. It's one perception of such a larger picture of human engagement that I wonder sometimes, why is it continued to have such perceived authority that it does? I'm not intending to express that to incite or encourage anything other than self-reflection and introspection around what feels right within oneself in correlation with what is being said and really what is not being said in this opinion, in any opinion, whether it's the opinion of the Supreme Court or the opinion of a person that is perceived as homeless. There are some, like, I feel as though I don't gravitate toward reading the rest of this. Like, it kind of feels like that gravitation has dissipated. So I am going to move on.